Christ is among us.
He is always shopping.
Good morning, everybody. God bless.
Morning, Paul.
So my question for you is, did you have a nice Boxing Day? Why are you laughing? Does anybody here actually celebrate Boxing Day? Good for you. Does anybody here not know what Boxing Day is? It's the day after Christmas where you punch people. No. It is the day after Christmas, and in the United Kingdom, but also in Canada, it's a special day where you come together, and I guess the boxing has to do with the gifts or something, right? That's the history of it. But in Canada, for example, Christmas is usually you go to church, you spend your day at home. Boxing Day, the next day, is when all the family gets together at one person's house. So in America, we collapse everything into one day. You know, at least they're civilized and they have several days of enjoyment. So they have Boxing Day the day after Christmas. Now, growing up in Detroit is very close to Canada. In fact, if you grow up in the Detroit area, you literally grow up north of Canada, which is pretty exciting. So I'm one of the few people who can say I grew up north of Canada. But I had an aunt, my Aunt Mary, who at a very tender age was married off to a young Romanian guy from Ontario. And so went to start her family and her life in Ontario, working a very hard life in a farm with just her and her in-laws. She was maybe 15 years old when she was married off and went to live. So this was 1940s. And it was a hard life. It was a very hard life for her. She ended up having 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. And my father would love in the summer times to go work at the farm to get away from the craziness at my grandparents' house. And there he would go and help them bring in the tobacco or the corn, whatever it was that they were growing that year. And so growing up then, one of our family traditions from Detroit was to go to visit the Canadian cousins and my aunt and uncle in Ontario, often on Boxing Day. So this time of year I'm thinking a lot about my Canadian family, and I'm thinking about my Aunt Mary, who unfortunately passed away about 16, 17 years ago now. And my Aunt Mary was quite a wonderful character. We would come, I was this snotty little Oakland County kid, trying very hard to be something I was not, and then we would go to the country, and here, the city cousins would go visit the country cousins, and you'd realize what really matters in life and what's valuable. My Aunt Mary, that house, you'd go back into it, it was still that kind of 1940s feel to it. It was, when they put us to bed, if we'd stay overnight, they'd put us to bed, and we'd try to sneak out, me and my other cousin, Juliana, and we'd have to be very quiet because all the wood was very creaky, so they'd hear us and yell at us to go back to sleep, but we'd want to listen through the grates on the floor to hear what they were doing downstairs. It's good memories. And my Aunt Mary would always be extraordinarily generous with us. She always had wonderful gifts for us to give. And I always felt very kind of embarrassed and ashamed because, we didn't do anything to deserve it, but we loved it. And but whenever she talked about how life was hard, she would say, what are you going to do? And she would just smile, and she would laugh. And you think, oh, she's pretty happy. She's a pretty happy person. She's content with her life. Little did I know, as a child, that that was her way of coping. But the reality is that for many years of her life, she suffered with crippling depression, and really, really a lot of sadness in her heart and her life. I didn't realize this until I was older and got to go downstairs for those conversations that once I tried to eavesdrop on. I think of my Aunt Mary because it reminds me now of how incredibly easy life is in North America, and how many blessings we really have. We celebrate the new year, and as I said on New Year's Eve, and yesterday, we're all bemoaning 2021 and 2020 as these god-awful years, but honestly, I mean, how bad were they in the scope of human history? They were, oh my gosh, we had to go to a different store to find toilet paper for all of 2 weeks in 2020, and then after that we had to wear a mask here and there. Big deal. Boo-hoo. It was really not that hard of a time. And so I think about what she lived through and what she had to go through and grew up. She was married off because her mother was my grandfather's first wife, and was married off young because the first wife had died. And when my grandmother came, I'm sure she was happy to have only her children in the house and not have to worry about it. So having her married off early was quite convenient for my grandmother. Didn't help things at home, and that marriage didn't last either. So things all worked out, I guess, for the best in the end. But then I think about even farther back in history. And today in particular, we are commemorating this incredible mother, St. Juliana the Merciful. St. Juliana the Merciful has a special relationship to our parish here at St. Mary's because our lay auxiliary is dedicated to St. Juliana the Merciful. So when you hear a St. Juliana Fellowship, or used to be St. Juliana Sisterhood or Guild or whatever we call it, St. Juliana Fellowship is our lay auxiliary, and they do a lot of good works inspired by this incredible woman who I can't help but kind of project a little bit of my Aunt Mary onto when I read her story. St. Juliana was born in Moscow in about 1530, so she's a contemporary with Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, the great Tsar, fearsome Tsar. And her father was actually a dignitary in his court. But her parents, both of them died when she was about 6 years old. And so she was raised by her aunt and her grandmother, and eventually at a young age, as it was back in those days, you had to find your way in life, and they married her off to a decently wealthy nobleman, but one kind of out in the country in Murom, and who had a property and kind of a manor and so forth. This was the Middle Ages. She was kind of a minor lord for the, you okay back there? The town of Lazarevo. And there she wanted very much to be, having tasted the kind of both the sweetness of life at a tender age, but then having also suffered loss and realized the transitory character of this life and the fleeting nature of this world's pleasures. She had it in her, she wanted to become a nun, to live a monastic life, but that wasn't her option. It wasn't freedom to just do what you want. So she was married off to this fellow Osorgin, George Osorgin, and there became, as it says in the saint's life, a model wife and a perfect mistress of her household. Now, of course, we have a very different idea of what that means today because of all of our kind of American late capitalism. What does a model wife mean? And we have the memory of all those 1950s advertisements, I'm sure, floating in our head. Back then, I mean, this is when they're writing about it in the saints' lives, we're talking from a biblical point of view. She is like one of those women from Proverbs who helps her husband in his work. She is a helpmate, like Eve was meant to be for Adam, a partner in the development of this household. And as a minor lord, that's how they made their money, was they managed this estate, they raised the crops, they had serfs, they had all this wealth that they had to build and manage and maintain. So, but she wanted to be still very ascetic, and she wanted to give away as much as she could to the poor, because she saw, especially in her own village, how many poor people there were. But she couldn't just give away the wealth of the plantation, so to speak, the manor, wasn't hers to give, even though she was the wife. And so she worked with her own hands in her own cottage industries to raise money so that she could turn around and give to the poor, not keeping any of it for herself. And whatever she got as a gift, she turned around and gave it to the poor. Even when when people were hungry, she would ask her mother-in-law for second helpings and then sneak them off to poor people to give them, saying, well, because she said, I'm very hungry since I had children. I can never seem to satiate my appetite. Could you give me some more? And she turned around and gave it to somebody else. And she did have a lot of children. She had 10 sons and 3 daughters. And she lost 4 sons and 2 daughters over the course of her life. She had to bury. Can you imagine that? Having 13 children and having to bury half of them? Well, what are you going to do? Life is life. That's, according to the stories, she never complained. I'm sure she wept, but she didn't curse her life. She gave as much as she possibly could. And famines would strike. Now, for us, a famine is what we can't find the groceries at the grocery store. We have no idea. Back in those days, you ate what grew on your land. You couldn't go and get bananas from Belize or cocoa from Africa or whatever. You couldn't find any of that stuff, right? You ate what you had on the land that grew, and the animals that grew, and maybe what you could find at the marketplace from only so far away. And in 1570 and then later in 1601, there were famines in the land, and she worked very hard and tirelessly to help the people in her village. In 1601, the famine lasted at least 2 years. We're 2 years into a pandemic. Our life hasn't been that disrupted. 2 years into the famine in 1601, people were eating other people. That's how bad it was. Talk about, it's like The Walking Dead, okay? I almost think that those shows like The Walking Dead are all almost like genetic resonances of the trauma of our previous generations. Because we have no idea what a real disaster looks like in our comfortable life here. And she did everything in her power to feed. By that time, her husband had died, and so she was able to dispose of the property and to give as much of it as away as she possibly could, and helped feed and save all of those lives. And if somebody said, I got to get out of here, I can't feed my family, will you release us from service? Because serfs were essentially slaves. She gave them freedom. She treated them like they were her own children. She did not want to see a single person under her care pass away. And so she was remembered for her incredible love, and she's called the Merciful. When she died in about 1604, having survived the famine, but being decimated in body, her children were worried about her because she ate so little that they thought she was going to starve herself to death. And she said, what value is it for me to feed the worms? Put a little more fat on this body that's just going to feed the worms in a short time. What value is it to thicken my flesh if I lose my soul? That's the kind of stuff she was dealing with. And then she passed away glowing with light. Some of you have heard the stories or have seen people. Father Kalchu had that light on him as he was passing away. She was one of these people that literally was glowing when she died. And 10 years after her death, when they, as is often the tradition in Eastern Europe, after so many years, they disinter her body and check on the body and make sure everything's okay. Her body was incorrupt, meaning it had not decayed, and was not only incorrupt, what was emitting myrrh and a fragrant scent, and that myrrh was healing and had miraculous properties. And so ever since then, St. Juliana was treated as the local saint of Murom and Lazarevo. She wasn't canonized until 1988, however many years later, almost 400 years later, but was treated as a saint locally for all those centuries. And now she's our patron saint of our church. So, I don't know why I'm telling you this story other than to inspire you maybe to think a little bit about what you have, how good your blessings are this year, and, could be worse. The Russian optimist says, could be worse. And St. Juliana survived what we just can't even imagine. And unfortunately, there have been events like that in recent history. The famine in Ukraine that took place in the last century, which killed so many people. It's not that far away. It's not that far away. So I don't think we should just assume we're never going to have to deal with hard times like that again. But when we study these saints and we look at their lives, maybe we'll be a little bit better prepared in our character, so that if the time comes for our testing, we might be ready to do it. I'm hoping for the best for 2022, so I don't want you to be worried. I think it's going to be a good year, but you never know, and we have to be prepared. So let us take the strength of our holy mothers and our holy aunts, and remember how to be generous and how to be kind and how to be merciful, and let that be the thing that defines our approach to life in these days to come. And then maybe, we won't be so ashamed when we come into their presence in the day to come. Christ is among us.